Akedah Project.
We invite you to join.
One story, many angles.
Come learn with us.
The Akedah is not our story. And I mean that in two senses. First of all, the Akedah is not our story. In other words, only our story. And I'll explain why I say that in a minute. But I also want to say that it's not our story in the sense that it's not our foundational or constitutional or formative story of who we are as a people. And I think that's important. Given the reams and reams of interpretation and the many videos even on this website with this amazing project, you would think that this is one of the most significant events that happened in the entire Tanakh, especially for the Jewish people. And I want to say that that is not the case. This is an event that happened in Abraham's life. Many other events happened in Abraham's life. This is an event that happened in Isaac's life. There were other events that happened in Isaac's life. But given the drama of the story of the binding of Isaac, the Akedah, and the attention that it's commanded throughout the generations, and even the centrality that the narrative holds in the upcoming high holiday liturgy services, you might be fooled into thinking that there is indeed something foundational or constitutional or formative about this story for Judaism, for the Jewish people. But again, I say there is not. Now, we know that this is so for several reasons, but the main one is that we actually have two control groups, right, that we can compare ourselves to. Other religions who count this story as part of their heritage and have made it foundational or constitutional for themselves. And I'm referring, of course, to Christianity and Islam. Right? For Christians, the sacrifice of the Son is the story, right? Heavenly Father, his only begotten Son, sacrificing for the sins, to atone for the sins of the world. And so how does that connect to this? This version of it, Abraham and Isaac, is simply a precursor, a harbinger of the real deal yet to come. In fact, of the many claims that the church has made historically regarding Judaism, obviously many of them critical, it is that we Jews never accepted the ultimate New Testament fulfillment of this partial and incomplete Old Testament sacrifice. Okay, so there, the Son that is sacrificed is the central figure in the religion, the central tenet of belief. Now, in Islam, the centrality of the story is no less striking and also no less central, right? The very name Islam means submission, right? That's not an invention of Michel Houellebecq in his recent novel. Of course, meaning submission to the will of God. Okay, that has a cognate in Hebrew, hashlama, lashlim. And actually, if you know the story from the Quran, even though it is Abraham indeed who receives a vision from God of him about to sacrifice Isaac on an altar, he brings that vision to Ishmael and asks him, or he brings it to his son. His son is not named in the Quran, but he brings it to his son, and his son says, well, if that's what you've been commanded to do, then we must do that. Okay, later interpreters, of course, have supplied the name of the son. Several thought it was actually Isaac, but in fact, the mainstream Islamic tradition, of course, says that it is Ishmael. And so it was the willingness of Ishmael, the son, to submit to the will of God, for himself to be sacrificed, that's held up as exemplary, and it then becomes Ishmael who becomes the progenitor, right? So again, the very name of the tradition is submission, taken from this story, and the submission to the will of God, the willingness to sacrifice and be sacrificed, essentially to sacrifice oneself for the will of God becomes a central tenet. Now, we will read in the liturgy of Yom Kippur about Aseret Harogei Malchut, right, the 10 martyrs. And there is, of course, an idea of martyrdom in Judaism. There are no martyrs really who fit that category in the Tanakh itself, but certainly afterwards, starting in Maccabean times, Hasmonean times, and later in Rabbinic times, and of course throughout the Middle Ages in Christian Europe, etc., there are martyrs, but it's not the same sort of ideal that it is in Christianity and Islam, and it's partially because of the role that this story plays, okay? So for that respect, I say that it's not our story. This has become their story, because they are also heirs to whether it's the Bible, the Old Testament, or the figure of Abraham, Ibrahim Abuna, Avraham Avinu. We, on the other hand, when we look to Avraham for his paradigmatic acts, we often talk in the context of Akedah, how could he have submitted so apparently passively, so apparently meekly, when in fact, in a few chapters, he will argue, he will challenge God of God's declaration that an entire city be destroyed. And so there is another paradigmatic act of Abraham, but that's not even my main point. My main point is simply that we do not define ourselves as Bnei Abraham. Of course, we are also Bnei Abraham, and Abraham is Avraham Avinu. But when we talk about who we are, what is our name, right? If Christianity follows in the path of Christ and Islam follows in the path of essentially the son who submitted to be sacrificed, we are Bnei Israel. Israel is the, again, paradigmatic, constitutive, foundational name and figure, personality, and act. Where does that name come from, right? We are, of course, also Bnei Yaakov, but specifically Bnei Israel because he also had an event in his life. He also had an encounter with the divine. And what was the conclusion of that? Vayomer, Lo Yaakov yamer od shimcha ki im Yisrael, ki sarita im Elohim v'im anashim vatuchal. Okay, that is from Genesis chapter 32. Your name shall no longer be Jacob, Yaakov, but Israel, Yisrael. For you have striven, you have struggled, sarita, with beings divine and human, and have prevailed. Okay, so to me, the message is crystal clear. If you have two choices or two, call it spiritual paradigms to choose from, the one of submission to the will of God, and in particular, in this particular story, it's submission to do violence, to act against what you know to be your morality and what you thought divine morality was going to be, right? It's to be willing to sacrifice the thing that is most dear to you, with no argument, with no challenge, with no apparently no autonomous moral agency as a choice. You receive the command, you do it. That's one paradigm. And the other paradigm is to struggle, is to wrestle, is to challenge. And that is also a paradigm that is developed more fully in rabbinic literature. If you're familiar with the story of the oven of Achnai, there is a halachic dispute about what is not relevant, and it's one rabbi against the majority of rabbis, and the majority, of course, have the majority on their side, but the single rabbi has God on his side, and he says, let heaven adjudicate this dispute, and a voice comes from heaven and says, the halacha is according to Rabbi Eliezer, and the others say, well, we don't listen to voices in heaven. We are here on earth, and we are struggling with this ourselves. And the rules that we've developed, that we've received from the Torah, of course, is that the majority of scholars in this particular discussion are going to decide. And what was God's response to that? According to the story, of course, he says he smiled in heaven, laughed, in fact, and said, "Nitzchuni banai, nitzchuni banai. My children have defeated me." And he apparently takes great pleasure at having been defeated in that struggle with us, his children, as many parents would when they see their children grow up and become autonomous, individual, grown human beings who take initiative and who sometimes might rebel and who sometimes might go on to do other things, even potentially greater things than their parents might have expected of them or commanded them to do. And so what I leave from this story is, as we say in Hebrew, kvodo bimkomo munach, right? It has its place, it has its position in our tradition, in our liturgy, but don't make that the defining feature of either Abraham's life or the Tanakh or our identity as a Jewish people.